Good morning. This is Fred Zabonik. We will get started here um, in about 8 minutes. Thank you. Good morning. This is Fred Zabonik. I am the manager of asset management services. Um, Michelle Williams, who works with me, she is also on the line. And
Good morning.
what, so, how this process works is when we send out an email, um, our customers were instructed to um, contact Michelle, and then Michelle would give them information on how to get on to the GoToWebinar site. So you should be able right now to see my desktop. And obviously, you call in as part of the webinar process to listen on the phone. But you should see the asset management policy webinar. Then basically, this is like the table of contents, and it shows December 5th as the date up there. Now, throughout this morning, we are going to have in excess of 100 folks on this webinar. Okay, and so logistics wise, you guys are all, when you sign in, you're on mute. Okay, so if you want to, ask a question, there is a questions area on your screen where you would type in your question, and then Michelle will look at the question and stop me so that I don't ramble too much, and then we'll try to get your question answered. Um, as far as the annual policy webinar, this is a requirement, and to meet the requirement, there needs to be at least one person from each agency, board, and commission who attends. Now, we understand there are some folks who um, could not meet at this time. They have a standing meeting or whatever. And so our plan is um, we are recording the webinar, and then we will post the webinar to our website. So if an agency did not attend right now, they can listen and get credit for attending if they go through and listen to the recording on our website. So um, we have a lot to cover in this hour, and um, so some of these topics I'm going to go through pretty quickly, so we make sure I don't keep you over the hour allotment. Um, so with that being said, we're just going to get right into it. So on your screen right now are the main topics that we're going to cover. We will go over the Ohio Revised Code, Section 125.16, which is the law that basically drives the bus with asset management. We will also then cover the requirements for annual certification, and also there, number 3, the FY19 biennial physical certification. We will cover the physical inventory counts and what should happen when assets are not found. We'll also cover the assets disposed as permanently missing. And then we'll go through some scenarios. We'll discuss the auto discovery method there, number 6. We'll also discuss the retiring assets using the disposal code does not meet threshold. And we'll go through the scenarios there. We will also talk about proper disposal codes for cell phone disposal. We've had several inquiries about that, so we went ahead and made that a discussion point. We will also have on there on our Power or our Word document the OBM audits there, number 9, and what OBM is looking for, so that you can properly record your asset activity and not have an audit finding. And as most of you know, finding is not a good thing. So we try to do our best to give as much information to each agency so that you understand what your requirements are and what the OBM, and for that matter, the auditor of state, what they're looking for when they come and do an audit just on your assets. Number 10 there, we will briefly go over what should be done when you have suspect an employee of doing wrongdoing or illegal activity. Then we'll talk about the cost thresholds for both personal property and real property, what the rules are there, what's required to be inventoried, and what is voluntarily inventoried. We'll also discuss how to identify capital assets, because basically capital assets are high dollar amount items. We'll briefly touch on licensed vehicles, and then we'll get into scenarios with attachments to existing assets. We'll cover installation costs, situations with tagging assets, what to do when you're adding a record and you don't have any of the original cost information. We'll touch on the donations to state agencies. Number 20 there, we will discuss the interagency transfers, which seems to be more prevalent than it has been in years past. We'll also talk about the custodian policy with shared equipment. And then we'll touch on the Ohio Revised Code 117.17, which is the letter of representation by retiring head of state agency. That is a hot topic now because some heads of state agencies have already left, and some will be leaving based off the new administration and the new governor. And so we will go over that as well. And now that'll be the last talking point for this morning. Okay, so I'm going to get out of that document and pull up the actual PowerPoint that we're going to go over today. Okay, so with this Ohio Revised Code, the Ohio Law, Section 125.16, and this, and before I get into this too much, at the very top of the PowerPoint there, or the Word document, there's a link to our website. And I want to pull up our website briefly. It's a little slow here this morning. It's a lot slow this morning. Wow. Okay. So for the folks who have not been to our website, you go through the DAS website, and then you click on Divisions, and then General Services, and then Asset Management Services. This here pretty much gives you everything. I don't want to say exactly everything, but most of the things you need to know are housed here. The biggest one is, here's the Ohio Revised Code, the 125.16. You can click on that, and that will take you right to the actual document. But underneath here, the Asset Management Handbook, a lot of what we're discussing today, it comes from the Asset Management Handbook. So I just wanted to bring that to everyone's attention if you have not been to our website. Okay, so back to the policy in the 125-16. In Section A there, it says, in accordance with procedures prescribed by the Director of Administrative Services, the officer in charge of each state agency, other than an institution of higher education, shall maintain current and accurate records of tangible personal property and real property as defined by the Department of Administrative Services. So basically, the law gives the Director of DAS the authority. The Director of DAS is giving Michelle and I authority to say how you should record not only your equipment, the tangible personal property, but the agencies who also have real property, such as land and buildings. Okay. In the second paragraph there, that refers to the certification, and so it says on or before the first day of October, immediately following the end of each fiscal year, the officer in charge of each state agency shall cause its inventory activity at the end of that fiscal year to be certified as correct and filed with the director. Well, and filed with the director means to file with us, and we have an online application where you certify your assets as being accurate. So that basically is the bus that drives what we do. Okay, so now I am scrolling down to page 2 here, and that is just basically a little picture of the certification form that's online, and that's Schedule A, which some of you probably are wondering. We have a fairly good amount of new people that are on here that are doing assets, And I want to make sure everyone's clear. The certification that must be done every by October 1st of every year, that is a certification of an agency's inventory. Okay, it's not divisions. So for natural resources who have, you know, different departments, they have watercraft, they have parks, they're, or let's say DRC who has multiple institutions. Those institutions are not certifying separately. It is an entire certification by agency. So there's only going to be one person from those larger agencies that are certifying. Whereas you could have a small board or commission that may have 3, 5, 10 employees. It's a lot simpler, and they're going to certify, but it's the same deal. Someone at the larger agencies, it will be one certification per agency. But that on your screen there is the online form that needs to be filled out. And then this page 3 is Schedule B, and Schedule B is basically for items that did not get, or I should say transactions that didn't get entered by June 30th, but yet they occurred before June 30th. So you may have gotten a bunch of computers in at the end of June, but those didn't get entered in time before the system was moved to the next fiscal year. And see, the reports that we run out of Oaks AM are based on, as of June 30, whatever's in the system before we move to the new fiscal year. So that's what Schedule B is all about. And then the bottom there is just a electronic signature and title there. So moving on to page 4, the FY19 biennial physical certification. This is also an online process, but as you'll see here, this is just one page of basically a date, and then when you did your last physical inventory. So the way this has been set up is that every odd fiscal year, so in fiscal year 17, now we're in fiscal year 19, every odd fiscal year, every 2-year period, the physical inventory has to be certified. Now, again, we said earlier the inventory activity needs to be certified every year, but taking a physical inventory is certified every other year. Now, some agencies will certify every year. They take an inventory. The law says you have to take an inventory within the biennium, within a 24-month period, but that doesn't stop agencies. The more accurate agencies are taking an annual physical inventory, and they will actually file every year. To be in compliance with the law, you have to file that you took a physical inventory within the 2-year period. So, okay, let's go scenario-wise. Okay, we're in fiscal year 19, which ends this coming June 30th. So if you took a physical inventory, if your agency did a physical count in fiscal year 19 or fiscal year 18, you're in compliance with the law. If you haven't taken one since fiscal year 17, then you need to do one this fiscal year, so you'll be within that 2-year range and you'll be in compliance with the law. So that's basically what the form looks like. It's a very simple form, easy to complete. Now, we're moving on to page 5 here. And in a physical count, this reads, upon a state employee recognizing that one or more assets cannot be found, the agency shall pursue an investigative review to find the asset. An investigative review may consist of a special review of documents, interviews with personnel, and or special physical inventory. During this time period, the asset may remain active on the agency's inventory. Okay, so you by Ohio policy, state employees that are doing physical counts should not record an asset as missing based off of one effort, one try. Hey, I don't find it, so I'm coding it as missing. Okay. What should happen is a second effort should be done, getting more employees involved to possibly find out what happened to that asset or where it is. It may be in a different area, maybe in a different building. It could be a different office or whatever. Um, the second part there says if the items in question are older assets, you should ask coworkers if newer equipment replaced the older assets. The older items could have been replaced by newer technology. In that case, the older items could have been sent to state surplus or scrapped. Now, if you have some newer equipment and it's only a few years old and you can't find it after doing a secondary review, using all your resources, then you should record the asset as missing. But a lot of times agencies are trying to what we call clean up their assets. They have a new, they're new to the process, and the person who did the inventory before them had all these old records on the books. The records are in service, and yet they haven't seen them. Some of those older assets, more than likely, were replaced by newer equipment. If you can't, one of the things that should be done is if there's a question that it could have went to state surplus, but you don't have paperwork, there's no paperwork anywhere, we suggest you reach out to state surplus because they keep records. It's surprising how many records they have on hand. But if you don't find that it went to surplus, if one of your coworkers believes that it did get replaced by something else, even though you don't have the paperwork, the right thing to do would be to record the asset as it went to state surplus. So you would retire the asset in Oaks AM as retire by sale, because retire by sale is basically means it's that the item went to the auction. Now, you may not have paperwork to support that, and you should put that in the comments section in Oaks AM. On the basic ad page, there's a comment section where you can basically write a little couple sentences of why you retired this asset. There's no paperwork to be found. That is more likely the right thing to do than to just say, "Oh, it's all missing," when there's a chance that we did send that to surplus, or that surplus, it was so old that it was scrapped. And so that technology is 25 years old, and we still have this. We still have this asset as in service, and we haven't had that asset for years. But I think in an audit, you're still going to get an audit finding because you don't have the paperwork. But that's the lesser of the two evils, because you don't know if it's replaced by new technology. More than likely, it was scrapped or it was sent to state surplus. Now, down a little ways on the screen there, for the Oaks AM users, if you do end up finding an asset that you had previously retired and you find it, you should do an immediate reactivation and get that record back with the status of in service. And that, if for Oaks AM, that's a really easy thing to do. You're basically clicking a button and reinstating the asset. Now, there have been questions about auto discovery method for physical inventory. And basically, all assets that can be connected to a network have the ability to be pinged to find the current location of an asset. And this process may be used for an accurate inventory count. So, what I'm talking about is most agencies have an auto discovery tool, a software. So, if I have a laptop, and my laptop, if I connect it to the agency, to the network, when they do the pinging, the auto discovery, they can tell where the asset is, and that qualifies electronically the same as if you actually went and saw the asset. It's actually, you have more proof than actually viewing it with your eyes. But those IT equipment, that has to be connected to the network at the time that they do the auto discovery or do the pinging. But that is a process that is approved for a physical count. Now, there are occasions, and we mentioned before, where older assets cannot be found during a physical inventory. Now, if some of these assets don't meet the requirement, the dollar threshold, let's say you have a $300 chair, you can't find it, you have the option of disposing the asset or retiring the record with the retirement code in Oaks of does not meet the threshold, because truly these assets were never required to be inventoried by the state policy. And maybe your internal policy, your agency policy has changed. I know some agencies don't even have policies for assets. They go off the state. But yet there are some supervisors out there that truly want you to record, really, really low dollar amount items. And so then that supervisor's gone, a new supervisor comes on board. They're saying, hey, we can't find this $200 asset. And then the question is, well, why are we even inventorying it in the first place? So you can retire those records by using the disposal code does not meet threshold. Now, on the next page, page 6, and again, I'm going through this as quickly as I can. So if you have a question, please type it in, and Michelle will stop me. At the top of page 6, we're discussing the proper disposal codes for cell phone disposal. And I have worked with Surplus and Amy Rice, and she has informed me that if you use Moby, or basically the e-cycle way of disposing your cell phones, those end up getting melted. And so the disposal code for those in Oaks AM would be scrapped. Now, on the other side of that, if you have devices and you use Lighthouse scrubs the items and then they deliver them out to state surplus. So your disposal code in Oaks AM would be retired by sale. Okay, so that's the difference. But it's basically a difference of which company you're using as to which disposal code should the proper disposal code to use. Now, I'm not going to go through all these. These are pretty self-explanatory, and what I'm speaking of is the OBM audits. And we had an OBM supervisor a few years ago give us some quick bullet points. And this is not the exhausted, this is not the entire, every little nook and cranny that they look for, but this is a decent chunk of information that they look for. And the last few years, that third bullet point there, the custodian, that is a big emphasized field that the OBM auditors are going after. Now, in this next section, This is the notification of employee wrongdoing, suspected illegal activity. And again, there's information here. I'm not going to go through this entire. This is if you believe that an employee is doing something wrong. Now, if at the top of page 8 there, if something was stolen, then by policy, the initial police report must be electronically saved and attached to the asset record in Oaks. And that can be done right on the basic ad page. Or for the handful of agencies that don't use Oaks AM, they also have to electronically have their initial police report assigned to that asset record. Now, initial police report, some agencies have law enforcement themselves, and some agencies, most agencies, will use the highway patrol. You can also use local police authority. Those folks could also be the ones that are used to come to your office or wherever the asset was stolen. Now we're going to get into the cost threshold. And at the top there, the Department of Administrative Services, including the Asset Management Service Office, which is us here, the responsibility ends and the state agency responsibility solely begins for state-owned assets not meeting stewardship reporting cost threshold, consumable supplies. So basically, low dollar amount items that don't meet the threshold, again, are not really required to be inventoried. And also that goes for the consumable assets. They are not required to be inventoried into an asset management system. But it's still the agency's responsibility to account for those type of items. They're just not reportable by accounting measures. Okay, briefly, I'm going to go through this as quickly as I can. The personal property, the cost threshold is if it's greater than $1,000, it needs to be inventoried. And this section here is straight from our asset management handbook. So you can use this or you can go to the handbook. There, number 2, the software, intangible personal property, basically computer software, if it exceeds $100,000, it is required to be inventoried. There, number 3, firearms. That is regardless of the cost. All firearms need to be inventoried and tracked. Then you have some categories of sensitive items, and those sensitive items, the threshold goes from 1,000 down to 500. So if something costs at least $500 in this area, so we're looking at like audiovisual equipment, communications equipment, antiques, surveillance equipment, power tools, that goes down, that if they're 500 or greater, they are required to be inventoried. Now in section 5 there, those are basically computing devices. Okay, so all computing devices, the requirement is that it's regardless of cost. Okay, regardless of cost. So most of the time, the all state agencies in 2018, the cell phones have computing devices. Basically, they compute.
Hey, Fred.
Yes.
I'm sorry for interrupting you. I do have a couple questions.
Okay.
One was, it said from Sheila Thomas. She says, Fred should mention that before scrapping listed assets, you should get approval from state surplus first.
Absolutely. That was from Sheila?
Yes.
Okay, so yeah, on that note, anything that you are going to get rid of. Whether you're thinking about throwing it away, you're thinking about sending it to state surplus, or you're thinking about transferring it to another agency. That all has to be approved by state surplus before you move on. So that's a good note. What was the other question, Michelle?
I have another question from Maria Seaman. It says, what about leased items? For example, MFD, large printers slash scanners, etc., or state cars.
Okay, so leased items, and we'll just go with copiers. It depends. So the cost per copy program, those are DAS leased copiers. Okay, so agencies wouldn't have to record those at all. DAS would have to record those. But if you're leasing directly from a company, then you need to track that copier while it's in your existence. Definitely. Now, vehicles, and we're going to touch on this, but I'll touch on it a little bit right now. Vehicles, all the vehicles have to be in Fleet, Ohio, okay, in that system. The only, the way we are working with Fleet now is that we will record the lease record in OXAM, and that is a requirement to record the record, but the actual asset itself gets recorded in Fleet, Ohio. So I hope I answered that question. Were there any others, Michelle?
All right. That's it so far. Thanks.
Okay. So back on page 10 with computing devices, that goes for phones, as long as they're not the old flip phones or phones that all they do are used as a phone. But most phones these days can email, can store information, so those would be required regardless of the cost. Now you see down here towards the bottom of this page, the real property, all land is required to be inventoried regardless of the cost. Also, easements to state land, and easements where the state can get access to someone's land. Both of those in section 2 and 3, the easements are regardless of the cost. They need to be tracked and inventoried. Now, land improvements, if they're greater than $15,000, they need to be inventoried. And some of the land improvement types would be like parking lots and sidewalks, retaining walls, yard lighting, some kind of fencing, and other structures. There could be like a statue or something like that. Those, if they're greater than 15,000, they need to be recorded. Now, there on page 11, number 5, renovations to buildings. If the renovation is greater than 100,000, it needs to be inventoried. So right then, we just talked about what needs to be tracked or recorded in an inventory system. Now we're going to touch on what is considered a capital asset. And so for the OXAM users, they understand that a capital asset, you would insert a profile ID that has a C on the end of the profile to identify a capital asset. So capital assets for equipment, tangible personal property, it's greater than 15,000. It's considered a capital asset. And again, for software, if it exceeds 100,000, that is considered a capital asset. Now, again, land is regardless of the cost. All land is considered capital. All easements are considered capital. Land improvements over 15 are considered capital. Now, with the buildings, and it says there, number 6, buildings that cost more than $15,000. Well, that sounds silly, right? Because every building costs $15,000. Well,
Right.
Not yet. Yeah. Yes, Michelle.
I'm sorry to bother you again. We have another question from, was it Christian, Petrovic? Anyway, she says, what if your company used to lease cell phones and tablets and now own them? Do they need to be inventoried?
Okay, so if you lease something from a company, you should have been inventorying it anyway because it's your responsibility. Okay. Now that, and then if you now own the item, you would still be inventorying the item, right? So you enter it as a leased asset. Now you own the asset, and even again, if you're leasing something from DAS, which some folks lease cars from DAS, some folks lease copiers from DAS, you don't put those on your inventory because those are DAS's responsibility. But if you lease directly from a company, while that lease is occurring, you're still responsible for that asset as far as maintaining it and being aware of where it is, and until you return that back to them, to the company, then you retire the record. But if you end up at the end of the lease owning the asset, you should continue to track that item until you send it to surplus or throw it away or whatever happens to it at the end of its usefulness. Were there any other questions, Michelle?
That's it so far. Thanks.
Okay, so back to the buildings. There are a few agencies that have buildings that are less than 15,000. They're like little sheds. So in that case, if it's less than 15,000, it's not considered a capital asset. But again, we had mentioned the renovations. Renovations that cost more than 100,000 are recorded as a capital asset. Now, the licensed vehicles. And again, we had mentioned with licensed vehicles, all the vehicle records are housed in Fleet, Ohio. Um, they are not put into Oaks. Now, unlicensed vehicles are posted in Oaks, and examples of unlicensed vehicles are like forklifts or gators, items like that. And if they're greater than 15,000, they're coded as capital. If they're not, well, in this case, with non-licensed vehicles, the cost threshold goes down to 1,000. So if you have a $5,000 Gator, that unlicensed vehicle should be recorded in Oaks. Now, in number 8, there, when we talk about infrastructure records, there's only 2 agencies required to report those. That's DNR and ODOT. But no other agencies are required to track infrastructure assets. And again, we talked about the inventory records for licensed vehicles being maintained in the Fleet, Ohio system. So we're at the top of page 14. In this section on attachments to existing assets. And it says when an attachment is acquired subsequent to the primary asset being placed into service, the new asset should be associated with the primary asset by adjusting its cost. But let's go back here because I was talking too fast. When an attachment is acquired subsequent to the primary asset being placed into service, the new asset should not be associated with the primary asset by adjusting its cost. So what that is saying is you shouldn't just do a cost adjustment to the main asset. Okay? The attachment should be recorded as a child asset to the existing parent item. The attachment, therefore, is recorded as a separate asset. Okay? And the asset will have its own acquisition date, funding, and cost. So you have two separate records in the system. You can tie them together by parent-child, but by no means should you adjust the original cost of the original asset that was in the system.
Hey, Fred,
Yeah.
I have another question for you. This is
Okay.
coming from Angela Schuster. She said, would small sheds that are not a permanent structure costing $3,000 need to be asset tagged?
Okay. So what OBM says is if permanent means um, basically bolted down to concrete, that is considered permanent. And then it would need to be, but if it's $3,000, it can be what we call a stewardship asset, where it can be voluntarily um, entered as a capital asset. But um, no, I'm sorry, it's voluntarily entered, but it's not capital. If it's less than 15,000, if you choose to enter it, it would not be a capital asset. No. um, okay, so we're still on page 14, and now we're going into installation costs. So installation fees should be included in an
Sorry,
original.
Fred.
Yeah,
I'm sorry to
yeah,
interrupt you again. Emery Jones made a comment he said, on a side note, when adding a leased asset, it should be marked as leased in the drop down location located under additional information and express ad.
yes, that's true. It would not
Okay.
be purchased; it would be leased. The acquisition type. Yes, that is correct.
Okay. That's it. Thanks, Fred.
um, so installation fees should be included in the original cost of an asset. If the installation cost for an item was not included in the asset record when it was first added, agencies should go to the cost adjust transfer page and enter the correct cost in and hit the save button. So in this case, if you bought something, you had installation fees on the original purchase and you didn't include the installation fees, you should go back in and do a cost adjustment to change the original cost. Now, um, if there are any maintenance fees associated with that asset, those fees would not be entered into Oaks AM because maintenance is a service, not a tangible asset. Now, if you purchase extra equipment for the original asset and the cost it meets the dollar threshold, you should enter a separate record. And then you can choose to attach that original record to the parent-child relationship. And one of the good things about the parent-child relationship is that if you go to in Oaks, if you go to retire the asset, one of those assets, it will automatically have a pop-up screen that will show you, hey, you have a child or you have a parent, basically giving you a heads up that if you're going to retire the one, should you retire the other? So it's just kind of a nice feature from PeopleSoft. So now in the section regarding tagging assets, and there have been a couple instances of this with agencies.
Sorry, Fred.
Where
I have another question. Sorry
okay,
to bother you again. Debbie Fagan just sent a question in. She said, in regards to attachments to existing assets, what if the attachment is a replacement part that the main asset needs in order to function? Hello?
okay. So what?
Oh, sorry.
Okay, I'm trying to understand. Read that again for me, Michelle.
In regards to attachments to existing assets, What if the attachment is a replacement part that the main asset needs in order to function?
No, and see, that's where it gets kind of gray because if you're talking about a part of a machine, um, the part is a supply. Okay, so, but if you're talking about an additional item that could go on another piece, it gets kind of gray there as far as what it is. So I would say in those cases, like Debbie, I would say we might need to talk about this one because if it's a something within it, if it's a little piece of something that is part of an item or a part like a supply, it may not be recorded at all. But it may. It just really depends on what it is, as far as if it's going to be considered a supply item or if it's going to be considered a tangible asset that we need to record. So I know that's not the answer that you want, but we really probably need to talk about this offline to go over exactly what the item is and what the part that would be replacing. So, um, okay, we're still on page 14 under the tagging assets section. So there are cases where agencies are considering tagging laptop cases and calculators and other small value items that do not meet the cost threshold. And one of the things that I would uh, kind of warn folks about is if you place a barcode tag on an item, um, then it must be entered into Oaks or an agency's in-house inventory system. It's subject to an audit. Okay, so if you put a barcode tag on there, then it's fair game. It needs to be entered into the inventory system. Another option would be to place a state of Ohio property label. Now, a property label basically says like State of Ohio, Department of Administrative Services. It doesn't have a barcode. It doesn't have any numbering system on it. And those don't get entered into any inventory system. But yet, if you're worried about theft, that may help deter someone from taking a laptop case or a calculator. But there's also issues of um, where people it takes more time and effort inventorying these low dollar amount items than the items are actually worth. So there's a question there on whether supervisors, it's up to everyone. You can enter anything into Oaks, and you can inventory any low dollar amount item you want, but you're truly adding to your, um, obviously adding to your inventory. You're also adding to your risk, and you're adding to your audit. The more items you have, the more chance you have of having an audit finding where it's fair game to be audited because it's in your inventory records. The second portion of that tagging assets section, barcode tags must have an agency name and or division or institution printed within the tag number. Okay, so like DAS, your tag number could say DAS and then be numeric number after that. We found some agencies aren't in compliance with this, and some agencies, I believe the Industrial Commission, they've reordered tags and they're going through the process of retagging their items. I'm not telling every agency right now you have to retag your items, but at some point you need to be aware that the policy states that you must have either your agency identifier, again, it could be DNR, or it could be, a division, could be, OIT, okay, as part of your division identifier, and then a sequential number. But there needs to be something. There are some agencies that use just numbers for their tag numbers. And, it works in Oaks, but by policy, it's not meeting that that standard. It goes against the policy. So we just wanted to make sure that we mentioned that today during the webinar. Um, this next section, adding assets when you don't know the original cost. So that happens a lot. Like during a physical inventory, you may find a tagged asset that is not in Oaks AM, and there's no paperwork anywhere for you to figure out what that when it occurred. Do you have a question, Michelle?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
Sparkle Watson has a question. She says changing tag numbers is just typing over old numbers, right?
Changing tag numbers in Oaks, absolutely. You can go on the basic ad page and just type right over the old asset with the new asset. But you have to make sure that whatever you have in your inventory system, whatever's in Oaks as the tag number, that is the same tag number for that item, that you physically have a sticker, a barcode tag on the item. But yes, you can. Changing the tag number is very simple in Oaks. You just type right over the tag number and click the save button. Um, so back to the physical inventory. When you find an asset that you believe should be recorded and it's not in Oaks, doesn't have a tag or anything, um, it would help to run an assets on hand report in Excel, um, because then you can sort the tag numbers. Or let's say, I'm sorry, in this scenario we brought up, there is a tag number on the asset when you do a physical, but that tag number is not in Oaks. Okay, so the item's tagged, but it's not in Oaks. And so if you run a listing of your assets in Excel and you sort it by the tag number field, you can see that asset won't be there by tag, but there may be similar items. It may have been purchased in bulk. So if you had a bunch of laptops and one of them didn't get entered, you could see the funding information based off of the sequential tags, the tag that came before that number and the tag that came after that number in that range. That could help you obtain the cost, the funding, and possibly the acquisition date. Now, the second part of that, at the bottom of page 14, there are instances when an asset must be tagged and entered into Oaks, but there's no way of knowing the funding, the acquisition date, nor the cost. In that case, you have to give your best estimate. Okay, you can go online and try to search for the item in question to obtain a fair market value. And then for the funding, you should use the fund that you predominantly use, that your agency uses for that type of item. Now, the acquisition date, that's going to be estimated based on similar items in your inventory. It's all going to be an estimate. And so because you're doing an estimate on those fields, when you enter the record into Oaks, you should definitely put something in the comments field on the basic ads page that explains how you came to those estimates. And that will help you when you're getting during an audit. On page 15, we go over donations. And a donation is treated the same way. It's a state-owned asset. A donation is defined as an asset bestowed to the state of Ohio without compensation when the donor relinquishes all rights to the gifted asset to the state. Upon acceptance and receipt of a donated asset, it is considered property of the state of Ohio, and as such, the asset is subject to the Ohio statute rules and policies that govern all state-owned assets. A transmittal letter shall accompany the donated asset, either completed by the donor or completed by the state of Ohio. But there must be a transmittal letter when an entity or a citizen donates something to the state.
have a question, Fred, from
Hmm.
Keisha Kraut at DNR. She said, what if we have pieces of equipment that have a barcode tag number attached, but over time it rubs off or falls off? For example, tractor. Can the tag number be written on the asset with a permanent marker, or would the barcoded tag number need to be replaced with a new tag number and corrected in Oaks?
You should retag it. You should retag it. And there are some times when if you can't physically pull the old tag off, the partial tag, if you can't physically pull it off, you should use a permanent marker and mark through it. But you should retag the asset, and then when you go into Oaks, do what we talked about earlier. Just type right over the tag number with the new tag number and hit the save button. Now, there is on the basic ad page, the audit log. There's a link for audit log, and you can click on that. And if you need to in the future, it will show you what the the original tag number was, and then when it was changed to the new tag number. If that helps during a reconciliation of inventory. Okay, we're almost through with the final page here. So interagency transfers, basically, we had mentioned before, you need to go through state surplus and get approval before you transfer something. Once you get approval, then if you're Oaks AM agencies, you need to submit an interagency transfer form to Michelle and I so that we will actually change the business unit for you, because we have access to change all business units. But again, when you fill out that form, which is located on our website, there's a section on that form that says the releasing agency. So you put in the items that you're releasing, and then the receiving agency has to fill out the bottom half and reply to the email so that we are all in compliance that, hey, yeah, this the receiving agency is saying yes, we either already have received these items or we are agreeing to obtain these items. And once we get that from both agencies, then we will do the actual transfer within the Oak system. In the section on custodian policy for shared equipment, for shared equipment, state agencies are permitted to assign an organizational identifier as the custodian for shared property. So, an example of organizational identifier could be a division, a department, or a section of an organization, such as general services, maintenance, tech team, real estate, capital projects, server team, and user support. Okay, so that changed this past year. We changed the policy so it doesn't have to be an actual person or a supervisor. It could be an organizational identifier for shared equipment. Okay, now we're coming to the end. We have one more topic, and this is the Ohio Revised Code 117.17. And in here, we have the actual screen print of the law. Okay. And basically, it says before the head of state agency leaves office, he shall prepare in the form prescribed by the auditor of state a letter of representation for his successor in office. The letter shall contain an inventory of all properties, supplies, furniture, credits, and monies, and any other thing belonging to the state, which is the duty of such official to turn over to his successor in office, or pay into the state treasury. One copy of the letters to be delivered. Um, so one copy of the letters to be delivered to the official, one copy to the successor in office, one copy to the governor, and one copy to the auditor of state and to the attorney general. Okay, so again, that may or may not affect you and your agency, but there's going to be several agencies that are in this situation where they're going to have new people in place because of the new administration change. So, all right, I talked as fast as I could. I hope I didn't confuse anyone. We have the ability to go back into the GoTo website and get the 117 people that are online today. Okay, or 115, I guess, because Michelle and I are counted in there. So 115 people, and so we will be able to tell if your agency was represented. But in the meantime, what we're going to do is we will send out a copy of this Word document that we used today, so that everybody who registered will have this, and you can reference it at any time. Just remember, this is not the entire state policy. This is a snapshot, and some of these topics were relevant because we've gotten questions in the past year on these types of scenarios. But then for any of your coworkers, or if there's something that you have a question about, you will be able to go online to our website, and our recording will be out there. Last year's recording is out there right now, and we will replace it with this year's. So if we don't have any other questions, thank you for your time. I'm only 4 minutes over. I apologize for that. And everyone have a great day. Thank you.